A very good evening to one and all present. On behalf of the Study Circle, I invite you to the 87th meeting. Today, the topic for discussion is regulating free speech on the internet, implant on intermediaries and citizens. Our speaker for the day is Mr. Sajan Puvaya, Senior Advocate in the Supreme Court of India. I now invite Mr. Om Prakash, Senior Advocate in the Madras High Court, to give the welcome address and a brief introduction of the speaker.
Good evening, everyone. I heartily welcome each one of you for this session of the Study Circle. There are many enactments which come into force. At times, even as advocates, we miss out as to certain implications. More than that, you have the rules being notified in under various laws. At times, as I said, other than this enactment, the rules will also not come into our notice. And there would be always an issue as to what implications it has on the citizenry. Now, in that context, the IT rules has got a wide implications, and there had been a lot of discussions and debates as regarding coming into force of these rules by a notification by the Central Government of India. About a month back, when we had a discussion about the study circle sessions, Advocate Sivashanmugam had suggested to me to have a session on the IT rules. And he also had a suggestion that I should invite Mr. Sajan Puvaya to speak on it. I said, okay, but I never had the means of reaching out to sir because I was not known to him earlier. Then after a period of time, we had a session by Mr. Rana Mukherjee. Post that session, when I was discussing, I have just suggested to sir that we would like to have a session on IT rules. Can you suggest somebody? His immediate reaction was that you call Mr. Sajan Puvaya. Not stopping with that, he immediately said, I will talk to him. I will share his number. You can always talk to him. He followed up with the next day also and asking me whether I have spoken to him, whether I have fixed up. I have to thank Mr. Rana Mukherjee at this hour. And after we have finalized for the session, and as we were circulating the program for various advocates and groups, and I had circulated in the WhatsApp group of the Tamil Nadu Senior Advocates Forum, very, very interesting comments and compliments had come saying that you have one of the best speakers. You have the right person to speak on a very interesting subject and being in need of the hour. So this is the background as regarding the topic. I'm not going to travel much on the topic because the speaker of the day would run us through, or rather walk us through in the context of the topic which he is going to say. Now, in any case, I have to have an introduction of the speaker. Mr. Sajan Puvaya graduated as a gold medalist with bachelor's degree in arts and an honors degree in law from the National Law School of India University. He was a Chevening scholar at the London School of Economics and Political Science, from where he obtained a master's degree in law. He has been a fellow of the Society of Advanced Legal Studies, London, and admitted as a solicitor of the Supreme Court of England and Wales. In fact, in one of the comments shared today, the senior advocate at Tamil Nadu had said he has been one of the best person who had come from Karnataka to practice in Supreme Court. Sajan Puvaya has been designated as a senior advocate by the full court of Karnataka High Court, and he has extensive practice on constitutional, corporate, and commercial matters in the Supreme Court of India, as well as various high courts of the country. Prior to his designation as a senior, he was the managing partner of Puvaya and Company, a full-service law firm with offices in Bengaluru, Chennai, Mumbai, and New Delhi. That will clearly show you as to what kind of carriage he is being done in the profession before even being designated as a senior. He has a multifaceted career options, career process. He has chaired the Karnataka State Council of the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, India's Apex Industry Association. He has also officiated as the India co-chair of the New York State Bar Association, Honorary Secretary of the Indian section of the International Commission of Jurists, and Vice President of the Society of Indian Law Firms. Apart to a vibrant constitutional and commercial law practice, Mr. Sajan Puvaya also devotes considerable time to represent social and environmental causes of public interest in the Supreme Court of India and various high courts across the country. I will not take much time to stand in between you and the speaker. I now invite Mr. Sajan Puvaya. I welcome all the participants for this session.
Very, very kind words. And you have actually pitched it rather high by saying that, he's a good speaker, interesting topic. The onus is now to make sure that I don't bore my colleagues at the bar. You should have said that he's a terribly average speaker. We did not find anybody else, and therefore he's filling in. That would have made my life easy. Then I would have spoken slightly better and people would have appreciated it. So now with this high benchmark, and that too, to the Madras bar and the Tamil Nadu bar, which itself is at a fairly elevated level in terms of intellectual exercise, I think I will have a task at hand. But let me, with your permission, first of all, start by thanking you for this opportunity. Madras in particular has been very close to my heart, even not just as a lawyer, but even traditionally. I come from Coorg. Although Coorg is a part of Karnataka in terms of the geopolitical significance, Coorg was always a part of the Madras presidency when we were really not a democratic republic. And therefore, a lot of what we do in Coorg takes its color from what Madras did traditionally, including the good and the bad months. We still follow the Adi Masa as compared to the Ashada in Karnataka. So in effect, we lose 2 months because half the population do not operate in Ashada and the other half not in Adi. So we are left with 10 months. Now, those are tidbits which actually connect me to Madras in particular. And I'm therefore very, very glad to be speaking to all of you. Let me spend the next 30-40 minutes, not so much in terms of enunciating what the law is in terms of sections and rules, because that will simply bore another colleague at the bar, because it's not that we are alien to the regulatory framework. But let me attempt to actually bring it from a perspective of technology and governance. And when I talk of governance, I don't mean public governance in terms of governance and polity, but I mean governance from a regulatory perspective. So if you look at internet as a whole, and if you look at the regulatory interface that is attempted to be brought on the internet through law, the exercise done in that form will demonstrate to us the pitfalls of that regulation and the gray areas of that regulation. So I'll possibly attempt to do that. Permit me to take you through a journey. Now, when we talk about the Information Technology Act, as lawyers, we look at the law, we say, oh, Information Technology Act, it's governing digital communication, it's governing digital media, it's governing electronic signatures, it's governing communications in any digital form, it's governing, it's just simply governing a network of computers. Consequently, it's governing the internet, because the information technology law was not brought in, so to speak, to regulate the internet. It was really a byproduct that it is regulating the internet. The information technology law was simply brought in to regulate transactions in electronic media. And because a lot of physical domain transactions, when translated and moved to the electronic domain, really changed color and changed focus. Therefore, the laws that applied to a brick and mortar structure or a transaction in the physical world really did not have application to the electronic part of the transaction. And therefore, the genesis of the law came up through an UNCITRAL model law and things like that. But very, very soon people realized, although the genesis of the Information Technology Act in India is 2000, in many other parts of the world, a little towards the middle of 1990s, but none of them really imagined that web and communications on the web and information technology from a web transactions perspective will grow so rapidly in the last 10, 15, 20 years that the law will now become more a focus on information technology on internet transactions rather than information technology on simple electronic transactions of the internet. Therefore, the focus of the legislation when the genesis occurred is far different from the focus of the legislation today. So in that perspective, let me just walk back a few decades possibly. And when I speak to a younger set of audience, I'm assuming that a lot of us in this group are in this age bracket where we are stuck between new technology and the old. Our education was possibly in slates and chalk pieces and formally and blackboards and reams of paper with a black telephone for trunk calls and exceptionally for good or bad news for lightning calls, sending posts and having pen friends. And that's how we started. Then we got onto TCP/IP accounts on the internet where you would dial in and wait for that sound before you actually connect and download a message. And from a TCP/IP account, we ended up actually having real-time internet in terms of real-time communication. We are those lawyers, I think we started briefing or preparing our decks from a perspective of manual typewriters with manifold papers, and then moved on to fax machines, which was actually, wow, it is excellent that the client communication comes to you instantly. And then from fax machines to possibly email. I think all our cards, when we started off at the bar, had a telephone number. Some of us had a PP number because it was one telephone which 4 or 5 of us used. And we, at some point of time, felt very proud to have a fax number on our cards. Just look at the life now. If somebody showed you a card with a fax number on it, you'll possibly never go to that lawyer. You'll turn up and say, we are better off without the gentleman. Now, we are stuck in that generation. Our children are not. Our children have been born into an information technology generation, and I will come to that as well. Now, of course, our parents really missed this whole bubble. You know, they landed up in a scenario where they were in a non-technology bubble where a lot of analog technology governed their lives, and still to a great extent, it is analog technology governing their lives. Possibly most of our parents still may not be very comfortable in terms of internet communication, or at least internet e-commerce transactions. Certainly, they would still prefer to go to a brick and mortar store, smell the fruit and feel the fruit and then buy the fruit, rather than buying the fruit off Big Basket or something like that. Now, let's therefore come back to our generation and then look at the Information Technology Act. When we look at the Information Technology Act as our generational batch of lawyers, we look at Information Technology Act as if it is something new, as if for the first time law is actually bringing some sort of an interface into technology, as if for the first time there is some sort of a convergence between law and technology. There is an attempt by the law to regulate how technology operates, and particularly how it operates on the internet. The answer really is not so, because if you look at traditionally how the law has developed as compared to how technology has developed, law has always possibly been 7 steps behind technology. There was once Professor Mitra, of course, I think a very politically incorrect statement to do in today's times, because we stand for equality, and particularly we stand for empowering the girl child. But traditionally, this quote made sense. He once said that law, you see, according to me, has its genesis in Hindu society. So they asked him why. He says law has its genesis in Hindu society because law is a faithful wife to technology. It is always 7 steps behind technology. And that is so true, because every time there has been a technological advance, law has attempted to come in and somehow control that advance. Control in the sense, not the bad way, not to turn up and say it wanted to stifle that advance. It wanted to regulate that advance. It wanted to see how the best of that technology can come in and how the worst of that technology can be penalized. How people who interoperate in that technology can be kept in check in terms of doing the right thing. That is how law came in. And traditionally, we have had technology legislations right through, except that we don't look at it from a technology prism. Please see that prior to we having steam generators and having large boilers to actually generate steam, which would then run the engine and run the factory or run possibly any other equipment, we did not have the Boilers Act. The Boilers Act came in as a technological answer to the fact that the boiler technology had actually gained prominence. And therefore, the question of imposing liability for a person who operates a boiler the wrong way had to be brought in. They had to decide who can be held responsible if the boiler really blasts and things like that. And therefore, a technology legislation came in the form of a Boilers Act, which said you will not operate it below a particular bar, you will not operate it above a particular bar, there will be somebody responsible, etc., etc. Simply, please look at the Motor Vehicles Act. The Motor Vehicles Act is nothing but a technology legislation. Of course, invention, motor vehicles, internal combustion engines, motor vehicles gained a particular speed, and therefore they needed legislation to actually see how we can regulate that technology. Motor vehicle internal combustion engine technology at one point of time between the 1890s and possibly the 1905 to 1910 was cutting edge technology. And therefore the law came in later to try and govern that technology and regulate that technology and see how that technology can be harnessed for mankind and liabilities can be attributed for wrongdoing. Please look at wireless telecommunication. Wireless telecommunication was invented, it developed, and therefore we have the Wireless Telegraphy Act coming in. Please look at the Electricity Act, the Electricity Supply Act initially, and then the Electricity Act. Electricity at some point of time was new technology, no doubt. Today, in our generation, possibly electricity was not new technology because we were always used to flicking a switch and lights coming on. But for my grandfather's generation, it was cutting edge new technology. to move from paraffin or kerosene lamps to electricity bulbs. And consequently, the law coming in to regulate supply, attribute liabilities, govern how the regulatory paradigm on electricity should be brought in, who should control it, etc. Please look at television, please look at radio. Every time technology has developed and advanced, a law has come in to regulate it. And therefore, Information Technology Act is just one such measure. When information technology as a mode of transaction and a mode of communication developed, there was a need to bring in legislation to govern it. And therefore, it is really an attempt from behind to attempt and regulate technology which is marching forward. And therefore, it will continue to have its pitfalls. If you look at the Information Technology Act as a legislation which is attempting to regulate something which has already marched ahead, you will then realize what pitfalls it can have. Now, keep that aside in terms of technology and the law. Let's now simply come to information technology itself. Most of us, as I said, would have started off with a TCP/IP account, early 90s. India really prior to the early 90s did not have even email accounts. When Sabir Bhatia and Hotmail.com came up and the whole world spoke about Hotmail, nobody really uses Hotmail today. And therefore, at that point of time, having a TCP/IP account and getting your full name on an email ID without having to put 123 after your name, instead of having Puaya123 or Puaya_Smiley and then getting an email account, if you simply got a Puaya as an email account, it was, wow, oh, you've got his full name as an email account. That was the level at which we entered the technology paradigm. Please see what has happened from then to now. I always look at it from a perspective of Web 1.0 and Web 2.0 going towards Web 3.0. Let me explain that very quickly in possibly a minute and then come into the law. Web 1.0, I really colloquially say so, for the entire transitionary period where internet was just a static bunch of information that was available. You could dial up a connection, you could actually enter the net, and therefore there was some amount of communication that was available, or some amount of information, not even communication, some amount of information that was available in static form. You could view that information, understand what is there. If you find something relevant, good. If you don't find relevant, bad. But that's all you could do about it. There was no interface which actually led to some sort of a interrelationship between that information and you. It was a static approach, and that was Web 1.0. At best, Alta Vista, for example, was a search tool. We would get onto the search tool, Alta Vista. You want to see California almonds, you would get some information of one web page of some California almond farm. On the top of that page, you would have a banner. That's why banner advertisements became a big thing on the internet. On that banner advertisement, you would have some advertisement irrelevant for you, that there is a motel in Al Camino Real in Los Angeles, which is a downtown motel, and it's giving discounts on its rooms. Now, who from Chennai or Bangalore or New Delhi would want to get a motel room in Al Camino Real in Los Angeles downtown for a discount over a weekend? Impossible. It didn't matter for somebody in India. A discounted room available in the West Coast or the East Coast for somebody browsing the net from Manjeri in Kerala or Coorg in Karnataka or maybe Tirupur in Tamil Nadu made no sense. But that was Web 1.0. What was available there is what you saw. Now that transitioned itself to Web 2.0 today. What is Web 2.0? I say Web 2.0 for that entire matrix of information where the internet is no more a simple static collation of information. The internet is today an interrelationship between parties. It is an interaction between information on one end and transaction on the other. Today, for example, on the internet, you just don't simply send emails or receive emails, etc. That is passé. That is something which happens as we go along. You have, for example, interrelationship between parties on the internet when it comes to social media interface. When Facebook, Twitter, name it, Reddit, etc. I'll come to Reddit as an example, a very illustrative example to see as to why is India not bothered about governing Reddit when it is so bothered about governing Facebook and WhatsApp and Twitter every day. I think half the front page of a newspaper today is in some form or the other. Definitely, for sure, the editor keeps it for some news on Twitter and the government of India. If the government of India is so concerned about regulating a Twitter, which has possibly 17 crore, 18 crore users, why is it not regulating Reddit, which has possibly 40 crore users? I'll come to that, that is why I said technology and law just don't seem to interrelate. Now in Web 2.0, you had transactions on the internet. You had e-commerce transactions. You would go on to BigBasket or Flipkart or an Amazon, buy things. You will relate to another party, either a one-to-one communication between Mr. Om Prakash and me by terms of email, or a one-to-many communication where I would actually have a Twitter handle and put up something. It is that internet which is actually permitting me to interface with you today through this platform called Zoom. I'm speaking to all of you as if I'm sitting in your living room, as if we are having this dialogue back and forth, without one thought that if somebody saw me here in my place, they'd think, what is this man speaking to some screen? 20 years ago, if this had happened, they would have said, this man is mad. He needs treatment. But today, it is absolutely normal that we can be in our robes. Have you ever imagined the fact that we would be robed with our coats and gowns and you name the trappings that go along with it, and start addressing a screen as saying, oh my Lord, I need an interim order, as if the screen is going to give you something. But why is that happening? That is happening because Web 2.0 has actually moved what you would do in physical domain to the electronic domain by virtue of that interface. Now, please for a minute, stop back as lawyers and look at it. A law which was made to govern a factual matrix in Web 1.0, which was a static factual matrix of you connecting on an electronic interface to fetch that information. The law governed that, saying, oh, when you're fetching the information, who's responsible for the information, who's liable, etc. A law which was oriented towards Web 1.0 today is being applied to a far more complex web, where we are having interrelationship, transactions, etc. on the internet. Could the law actually be sufficient as a tool to govern that? We don't know. Now, please look at what will happen 10 years down the line, not even 10, according to me, 5-6 years down the line. We will have Web 3.0. Now, you may ask me, what is this Web 3.0? Again, colloquially speaking, Web 3.0 is a scenario where in Web 1.0, I just went in, so got some information. Instead of browsing Encyclopedia Britannica, I went to the electronic version of Encyclopedia Britannica. I read something, I got out. But in a Web 2.0, I am having this dialogue and conversation and possibly even transacting with Mr. Om Prakash or anybody else in terms of, or maybe Mr. Madhvaraj who has his house for sale. We transact, we do pretty much everything in terms of closing a transaction. Or simply, for example, a study circle dialogue between you and me on the internet, 2.0. Now, what is 3.0? Web 3.0 will be a scenario where I will be interacting on the internet with nobody else but the internet itself. That is, the internet itself will have artificial intelligence. And that artificial intelligence will deal with me, giving me a false facade as if I am dealing with another human being. The bot, as we say, robotic technology coupled with nanotechnology, which actually robotic technology brings about a scenario where mechanical physical processes can actually outstrip or substitute human processes. Number one. Nanotechnology makes sure that instead of having these massive machines which look like monsters, nanotechnology will shrink those physical apparatus to such a small thing that a handheld can have it. There is a saying that in medical technology, nanotechnology one day will reach a stage where you don't need to have a dialysis machine outside your body to which you have pipes and syringes connected, that your blood flows to the machine and purifies itself and comes back. Nanotechnology will reach a stage where you will possibly have a dialysis machine which is this small, which will be implanted into your kidneys. Now, therefore, please combine the fact that you are having nanotechnology combined with what? Combined with multitude of computing power today. Today, computing power in terms of big data, computing power in terms of machine learning and deep learning. What is big data? A multitude of huge amount of data, for example, of the entire populace of Tamil Nadu. What have they been doing for the last 1 week, given the pandemic situation, lockdown, etc.? What have they reading? What have they been shopping? Have they not been shopping? Have they been browsing this site, that site, etc., etc.? Or like the Zoom story, we now have a cat in our seminar. So welcome, cat, which is a good thing. This is possibly the first time I'm speaking to a cat. I've spoken to lawyers who are cats, but I'm speaking to a real cat for the first time. Now, coming back to this, therefore, that data of 7 crore population, let's say of Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, or 12 crore population of Maharashtra, or maybe 20 crore population of UP, entire data set, that is big data available. Now, what would you do with that big data 20 years ago? Nothing, because you did not have the power to harness, you didn't have the computing technology to harness that data and profile a particular sequence. But today, the computing technology has grown so much. 1950s, the mainframe computers. Why 50s? Let's not go to 50s. Let's just come to 1990s. In 1992 to 1994, when you had a PC-80 or a DX2, whoever had a DX2 machine would remember, you had a 40 MB hard disk, 40 megabyte hard disk. Today, 40 megabytes is not even a chip in your little camera, which is a SLR camera. Your mobile phone today has up to 1 terabyte, 512 GB is standard now for an Apple phone. You can get up to 1 TB of space. Now, please juxtapose that to the fact that you had a massive machine which gave you 20 years ago or 25 years ago, say 30 years ago, a massive machine which gave you possibly a fraction of a computing technology and storage space of 40 megabytes. To today, that your handphone will have 1 terabyte. And 20 years down the line, we don't know that 1 terabyte can actually come in the smallest of chips. Now, 1 terabyte of information is unbelievable amount of information. Now, that is processed by a mobile phone today. What a mainframe computer of IBM did not do 50 years ago. Now, with that computing technology, please see what happens. What happens is that you are, by combining nanotechnology, which is actually compressing physical apparatus, and machine learning and deep learning, which has computing power to actually go through the entire matrix of this big data and figure out how Suresh Madhvaraj will deal with, or the same incident, how will Om Prakash deal with it? In the same incident, how will Sajan Poya deal with it? How does it know? It looks at how Sajan Poya has dealt with it for the last 15 years. And then guesses saying that, okay, if 15 years, if he has consisted in this approach, 16th year, he will do the same thing. And that reaction comes to you. Therefore, when you are dealing with an interface called the internet, you do not have another human being on the other end. You have this artificially learned machine which is dealing with you. Now, please come back to the law. You had a legislation which said that we will govern interface on the internet and attribute liabilities in a Web 1.0 scenario. You are stretching it to its hilt and applying it to a Web 2.0 scenario where I'm actually dealing with another human being. Then you're looking at who's liable, who's not liable, which message to be taken down, which message not to be taken down. Please see how will you apply it to a scenario where I'm not even dealing with another human being. I'm dealing with simply a machine which has actually learned enough to deal with me in the best sophisticated way. Who do I attribute liability to? At what point of time? Forget even liability ultimately in terms of getting a decree and executing it. Let's forget about it. How do I even ask that person to comply? Today, hypothetically, if Mr. Om Prakash writes something nasty about me after this call, after this conference, and he puts it up on the study circle, which is absolutely defamatory to me, saying, who is this quack of a guy? Rana Mukherjee was wrong. We brought this man and he's messed it all up. So he's a fool. Don't even ever contact him. Defamatory to me. I can at least go file an action and say that message must be taken down. The author of the message is Mr. Om Prakash. Therefore, in law, he is also the publisher of the message because the author and the publisher fuse into one when it comes to technology interface. Therefore, please give me an injunction. Now let's go to Web 3.0. That robotic technology or the deep learning or machine learned message will actually put together various reactions from various people in Tamil Nadu who have not liked my talk. But put it all together and create an interface document and put it up on the screen. Who do I stop? Where do I get this injunction from? Who do I sue? The same law will continue. Reasonably speaking, for the next 5 years, the Information Technology Act is not going to get amended. And what will I do with the decree that I will get from a court, let us say in Tirupur or Madurai or Bangalore or Coorg or Manjeri or Silchar in Assam? I'm taking these places because these are actions that have been filed. You go to Silchar in Assam and get a decree or get an injunction saying this must be taken down. Nobody knows how are you going to enforce it? With that as the background, let's now come to the rules. We have the 2021 rules. Everybody talks about the rules. Oh, muzzling down of free speech. What is the government doing on one side? The second side, oh, internet intermediaries are the bastion of free speech. Internet intermediaries are necessary. Internet intermediaries left to, were the genesis of Arab Spring. There would be no democracy in the Middle East without internet intermediaries. Now the government is muzzling that down because they want to muzzle down free speech. On the one hand, government says security of the country, friendly relationship with neighbors, the governance is our matrix. We don't want a private company to come and tell us what is right, what is wrong. Correct. On the other hand, the citizens say, no, you're muzzling down these intermediaries. Why? Because these intermediaries gave us a voice. All of that debate is happening today when we are still in a Web 2.0 scenario, where we still are interfacing with people, where it is somebody uploading some information, somebody complaining about it. Please also bear in mind 10 years down the line, when there is no somebody, so to speak, in flesh and blood uploading that information, what do you then do? In that context, let me bring you to the rules. Let me bring you broadly to the Act and then tell you how little or how insignificant this whole governance has been. Whilst a big deal is made about Information Technology Act, Safe Harbor, etc., ultimately in my analysis, it is a small speck in the ocean. And I think little or no governance is even forthcoming until we actually look at this on a ground up churn, some sort of a Sagar Manthan necessary within the jurisprudential framework to bring about overarching regulations. I'm conscious that it is one evening and one study circle. So I'll just take one aspect and possibly, give you my views on that aspect. And then of course, open it up to questions. What does the Information Technology Act do when it comes to the intermediaries on the internet? Now, for broadly speaking, everybody knows who are all intermediaries. If I say Facebook, they'll say yes, intermediary. Google, yes, intermediary. Twitter, intermediary. May not be, etc. Reddit, maybe. But ultimately, what qualifies you to actually get the threshold of an intermediary? The test is simple. This whole intermediary business started from, again, traditional communication. That is, when, for example, telecommunication started, the question was that if A and B are speaking on a telephone line, whilst A and B may be inter se responsible and liable to each other, but if let us say A has threatened B on a telephone, whilst B may have a cause of action against A, can B also have a cause of action against the telephone company, because it is the telephone company which has enabled the communication between A and B. But for the telephone company giving that access, this whole defamation would not have occurred. So can I also bring, if not primary liability, can I at least bring secondary liability against this person who has facilitated the communication between A and B? That is how this whole intermediary concept started. The answer was no. A telephone company is nothing but a simple passive provider of connectivity between two people. That passive provider of connectivity has no role whatsoever in who calls whom. It has no role whatsoever on what is uttered by X to Y. And it has no role whatsoever what is heard by Y as regards X. In other words, those three tests continue to apply on the Information Technology Act today. To become an intermediary, one, you should not choose the originator of the information. That is, you don't choose who says what. Second, you do not choose the recipient of that communication. That is, you don't choose who should hear it. Third, you don't in any manner edit or control the content of that information. So you don't choose who's the originator, you don't choose who's the recipient, you don't in any manner edit or control the content. It is that standard which was brought onto the internet. And therefore, most large internet companies fell within that domain of intermediary scenario. For example, Google. You use Google as a search tool. You punch what information you want on a Google search bar. Once you have searched, let's say whether Sajan Pua, somebody told me that one of the most searched term of me is, who's my wife? Sajan Puaya, you type and you'll automatically, it'll get auto-filling is Sajan Puaya's wife. So I said, this is interesting. If I had known that this is what would happen, I would have deferred my marriage by a few years. Possibly, I would have had multiple choices, but that's not to be. So therefore, on the internet, you search what you want. You ask for Google to give you that information. What does Google do? Google simply collates the information that is available on the internet and indexes it in a form that it is available to you. In a nanosecond, in a split of 1 second, it will possibly collate 3,000 pages about the information and put it in an order that the most relevant information is available first and the least relevant information is available last. And therefore, in other words, it does a cataloging exercise or an indexing exercise very quickly. For example, if you go into a library which has, let's say, 200,000 books, and you want to physically search those 200,000 books to get a relevant book which you want to read, let's say on urban transport planning, it would take you a lifetime. But at the same time, if the librarian has indexed and cataloged all that books as a part of library science, and that index and catalog is available for immediate research to figure out where is transportation and where is urban transport kept, and therefore I can find my book within that section. That indexation, which was otherwise physically done by virtue of a library science expert in a particular library, is exactly what Google does on the electronic domain. For Google, library is the trillions and trillions of pages of information that is available on the internet. You are the person who's choosing to get a particular information. That information may be, what is Mr. Om Prakash's fees? Because I want to hire him for a matter. So I say, Mr. Om Prakash fees. Now Google will make sure that it collates that information from the multitude of pages that is available and puts the most relevant page available to you in the form of an index. In other words, it is an indexation tool. Now that indexation tool, does it choose who should ask for the information? No. Does it choose who should receive the information? No. Does it in any manner edit or modify the contents of the information? No. It does not say that, no. In this case, I think Mr. Om Prakash's fees must be 20% more because a rich man is asking for it. So let me portray a higher fees. Or if a poor man is asking for it, let me portray lesser fees. None of it is done. Therefore, it falls within that domain of being an intermediary. And because it operates on the internet, it becomes an internet intermediary. Now that internet intermediary concept was expanded by law by virtue of the definition itself to include not just indexing platforms such as Google, but also to include one-to-one interface or one-to-many interface tools, for example, like Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, etc. Also to include marketplaces on the internet, for example, an Amazon today, a Flipkart today, a Big Basket today, etc. Big Basket may or may not be because they have their own inventory, but let's stick to general examples of Flipkart and Amazon. That is, Flipkart and Amazon don't maintain their own inventory. I'll give a closer home example. If I have a shop and I'm selling flowers in that shop, and I also put up a website to sell flowers online, then what I'm doing is that I am selling flowers out of my inventory. Therefore, although it is on the internet, and although that internet page is not going to choose who's going to buy, etc., it is still not an intermediary because you control your inventory. In other words, you control the data that is available on your platform. You therefore edit or modify that content. When your number of roses go down, you will actually modify it to saying that I have only so many roses available with me. So it's an inventory-based model on the internet. You don't qualify to be an intermediary. But if you are not an inventory-based model on the internet as a marketplace, if you're just a Flipkart where anybody can actually set up a shop on Flipkart and sell it, anybody can sell it through the medium of an online market space, then you become an intermediary. Now the problem arises there because the traditional concept of an intermediary and consequently the intermediary not being responsible in law is today extended to a Web 2.0 scenario where transactions happen on that intermediary platform. Then can you provide them the same benefit? By law, you are still providing the same benefit. An online marketplace is defined as an intermediary under Section 2W of the Information Technology Act. Section 79 of the Information Technology Act says, so long as that online marketplace does not choose who will buy, it does not choose who will sell, and it does not control or edit the content of the material that is being sold, it does not embellish or sugarcoat what is being sold, then it is an intermediary. Therefore, Section 79, which provides a safe harbor, in other words, in this big ocean, which has cascading liabilities called the internet, where legal liabilities can actually cascade to multiple levels, there is a safe harbor which is created where all these internet intermediary ships can anchor themselves, and that safe harbor gives them one protection. That is, for a transaction that has occurred on the internet, these internet intermediaries, so long as they follow the due diligence or guidelines or rules that are made under Section 79, will at the first instance not be liable. The only way liability can be cast on them is to show that they have not followed those due diligence rules, or to show that they have actually aided or conspired in that particular transaction. So therefore, the first principle of a safe harbor where an internet intermediary can anchor its ship has today become a really, really huge harbor. The safe harbor is really massive. And because it is massive, transactions continue to occur within that safe harbor, which may not always fall within the traditional domain of an intermediary protection in terms of not choosing who says, not choosing who hears, not choosing what is said. May not be the case because financial transactions happen on this internet intermediary, etc. That brings us to the 2021 rules. I'll touch only a few aspects of the 2021 rules, being conscious of time. 2021 rules is not a new weapon that has been brought to the table. Whilst our traditional media, and particularly the newspaper media, loves to portray the fact that there is this new weapon, the 2021 rules, which have come in and therefore internet companies are facing the heat. A good part, about 80% of what the internet intermediary rules of 2021 say, qua internet intermediary, not qua a digital publisher, etc. About 80% of it always existed in the 2011 rules. The intermediary guidelines rules of 2011 pretty much provided for the same thing. It did provide that if a notice is issued to the internet intermediary regarding taking down of content, that content must be taken down. There was a 36-hour window that was given. For pornographic content or content which is ex facie illegal, there was a threshold given to the intermediary that it should be not only taken down, but they must have methodology by which the repeat uploading of that information does not occur. There were general thresholds available for the internet intermediary in terms of receiving complaints and dealing with them. Then came, of course, the judgment of Shreya Singhal, which said that given the volume of information that is available on internet intermediaries today, a private notice to an internet intermediary is not going to work. Let me take a live example for it. Let us assume that, let's take Google as an example. Let's assume that there is some pornographic content on Google. At those events, because the content is ex facie, can be determined that it's legal or not legal. A notice being given by a private party may be sufficient for Google to pull it down. But in the case of Mr. Om Prakash and Sajan Poya, which I gave, where Mr. Om Prakash did not like what I spoke and therefore he wrote a nasty letter and put it up on his blog, which is defamatory to me. I think it is defamatory because it's poking me. But Mr. Om Prakash thinks that is true. Therefore, it is absolute truth. There is consequently nothing defamatory. He was only recording the fact that this man spoke like a buffoon and therefore, he deserves not to be heard. If I now issue a notice to Google, which owns the platform Blogspot, and tell them that, listen, this particular content about me is defamatory, take it down. Should Google take it down or not becomes the question. The answer to that is, how is Google going to determine whether it is defamatory or not? Does Google know what is my protectable reputation? Does Google know whether I even have a protectable reputation, number one? Does it know what is the value of that protectable reputation? No. Does it know whether I'm a good or a bad lawyer? If somebody calls me a bad lawyer, is that defamatory or is it true? Now, Google as an internet intermediary cannot adjudicate this issue. If you are actually expecting them to adjudicate in traditional parameters of jurisprudence, you are actually carving out state function, which is adjudicatory function, which are the exclusive domain of courts, and giving it to a private party like Google saying, you adjudicate. If it likes me, it will adjudicate in my favor. If it likes Mr. Om Prakash, it will adjudicate in favor of him. So you can't have a private entity arriving at this judicial determination of what is defamatory, what is not. Therefore, what is the answer? Answer is what Shreya Singhal said. Shreya Singhal said, although the rules say that upon you, the intermediary, you will not be responsible for content on your interface or on your platform, unless that illegal content is brought to your notice and you still don't take it down. Now, illegal content, which is per se illegal as pornography, yes, it is brought to your notice to take it down. But content which has to be determined, at least prima facie that it's legal or illegal, requires two things. One, it requires a court order, at least prima facie, asking the internet company to take it down. Or it requires a notification by a constituted authority of the government under the rules. It may be a computer emergency response team or it may be any other notified authority. Therefore, Shreya Singhal said, Supreme Court clearly indicated that when it comes to determination of content which is good, bad, etc., that role internet intermediaries will not play. The rules were read down to saying only upon a court order or upon a notified governmental authorities order, you will take it down. Now the question is, if you don't take it down even after that, what happens to you? What happens is you lose. It's not that you are liable automatically. It's not that it is not taken down. Therefore, come on, Google, punished. Google's officers go to jail. Absolutely not. The law simply said that if despite a court order, you don't take it down, apart from the fact that whether you're committing contempt, etc. is a different issue, you simply lose the safe harbor protection under Section 79. In other words, you will then become a co-accused or you will become a co-defendant and there will be a trial against you. If they find that your actions have led to a scenario where prejudice is caused, there may be a joint and several decree against you or there may not be. Therefore, at best, what happens is the first layer of the onion is peeled. The first layer of protection that is given to you as a ring fencing is removed. That's all it is. You simply then fall in the same pedestal as any other defendant. There should be a trial. You should be found guilty. Only then could there be a scenario of any penalty. But that is not to be. The way it is looked at today is that if an internet intermediary is not complying with the direction given by the government, they are guilty. This internet intermediary must be banned. It must be sent out of the country. That is the unfortunate granularity with which the discourse or the debate is occurring in our country today. Let me juxtapose it to the 2021 rules. Why is this whole rush in the 2021 rules as to why nobody spoke about the 2011 rules? Twitter existed then, Google existed then, Facebook existed, WhatsApp existed. Did we ever read saying, oh, Facebook, WhatsApp are facing the heat of the 2011 rules? Because 2011 rules had these mandates. Shreya Singhal is a 2015 judgment, which indicated what they should do, should not do. As lawyers, let's ask ourselves the question, have you ever read from 2015 to 2021, oh, Google is facing the pressure because it's unable to take down content? No, we did not. The difference is here. There is a level of protection in being abstract. As Hindu mythology will say, the minute you actually go into metaphysical domain, a level of protection increases. It is the physical domain which is the problem. It is in the physical domain that you must protect your limb and your leg and your head. Otherwise, it will be chopped off. But if you can become a Mayavi and go on to the metaphysical domain, then you can't be killed. Now, that is exactly what happens with internet companies. Most large internet intermediary companies which operate in India today are not Indian companies. Let alone Koo and Paytm, etc., etc. Whether Paytm is an intermediary or not, it itself a question. Let's leave it aside. Just look at Google. Google, which has Google Search, Blogspot, multitude of Google products, including YouTube today. It's US based. Look at Twitter. It's US based. It's US and Ireland based. Please look at WhatsApp, outside the country, US based. Please look at Facebook. Most large internet intermediary companies operate from outside the country. Number one. Number two, they have a common platform for the entire world. They do not have a country-specific platform. It is not that google.co.in runs a separate platform for India as compared to google.co.uk for the United Kingdom. Google.co.in can be a second-level domain name through which you may enter Google, but Google's platform is a uniform platform across the world. If a country does not want it to operate like China did, Google exits from that country, a local search engine takes over. Simple fact. Twitter, for example, is today a global platform. Now, when they operate a global platform for all countries across the world, some countries with higher threshold of libertarian approach, some countries with lower threshold of libertarian approach, some countries which are constitutional democracies, some countries which are autocracies, some countries are the middle path with benign dictatorships, some countries which have one Politburo of 80 people governing the country, and some countries like India where all 1.2 billion people want to govern. Now, please look at how an internet intermediary is going to manage its platform, one platform for the world, and the multitude of legal issues that operate on it. The difference is they did all well. How? They said, I will not have physical blood and physical bodies present in this country. I will take an example of South Africa. South Africa will want certain content taken off Twitter. South Africa government will want certain content removed from Google. What does Google do? You issue me notice. I will look at it. I will comply if it is a genuine request. But if I think it is preventing free speech and my platform is a free speech platform, I will not take it down. So what will you do, government of South Africa? Nothing. Can you arrest somebody? No. I'm sitting in the United States. What you should do, like India has mutual legal assistance treaty under section 105 of the CRPC. You file an FIR here. FIR lands up in terms of investigation. So under the mutual legal assistance treaty under section 105 of CRPC, you issue an MLAT request. MLAT request goes to FBI. FBI sends it to the local jurisdictional police there. And somewhere in California, that summons is gone and served on some X. It takes forever. They have this protection of not being available in the jurisdiction. And therefore, they have a sense of freedom or independence or the power to fight back. That sense of power by not being physically available in the jurisdiction is taken away by the 2021 rules. The 2021 rules today say that if you are a social media intermediary, Facebook, for example, and within that, a categorization that if you're a significant social media intermediary is anybody who has more than 50 lakh users. Every intermediary has crores of users in India. 50 lakhs is nothing as a number. As I said, Twitter, I think, has 17 crore users. I think Facebook has some 40 crore users, just in the country I'm talking of. Therefore, from that perspective, if you have more than 50 lakh users, you become a significant social media intermediary. What should you do? Under the rules, not in the Parent Act, the mandate is that you, the significant social media intermediary, you must appoint 3 sets of people. First, you must appoint a chief compliance officer. Second, you must appoint a nodal officer. Third, you must apply a grievance officer. It is the grievance officer's job to receive a notice and see how the grievance must be resolved. It is the nodal officer's responsibility to receive mandates from the government, for example, on blocking of content, etc., or on cyber security incident, etc., and deal with the government. And it is the job of the chief compliance officer to ensure that the internet intermediary is in compliance with all legislations, acts, rules that govern it. And more so, these 3 people cannot be people operating from outside the country. They have to be employees of this internet intermediary company, and they have to be resident in the country. In other words, if a Twitter, for example, pushes back saying, I will not delete this particular tweet which Sajan Poya has called some people some names or called the present government terrible things, but he has a right to say it. You are asking me to remove it. I will not delete that tweet, or I will not. Prashant Bhushan episode, for example. Contempt of court is a ground under section 19(2) to say that 19(1)(a) right can be curtailed on reasonable thresholds. If it is contempt of court, it is defamation, etc. Now, if Prashant Bhushan's tweet is not to be taken down and Twitter says, sorry, I will not take it down, the question is, how will it be enforced that it must be taken down? Traditionally, prior to the 2021 rules, Twitter's chief compliance officer was sitting somewhere in Ireland or US. Twitter said, do whatever you want, issue legal processes to me, I will defend myself, but you can't come and muzzle me down. But today, they have to be physically present in the country. If you don't comply, possibly the jurisdictional police will come knocking at your door saying, come to the police station. We are now indicating as to why you have not complied. If you don't have a rational reason why you have not complied, I will show that you are not in compliance with the 2021 rules. Because you are not in compliance with the 2021 rules, you don't get the safe harbor protection under section 79. If you don't get the safe harbor under 79, you are no more an intermediary. You become a co-accused in the scenario. Therefore, I will now make you accused number 8. And once you are accused number 8, come on, arrest, etc., etc. And then we know the whole 9 yards, which happens. It's very good for lawyers, bliss, good news. But the fact is, the internet intermediary will now shredder. Why? Because it has physical blood, human beings, so to speak, operating in this country. And the state machinery can actually bring pressure to bear, directly, indirectly, whatever. I'm not talking of illegal pressure. I'm talking of just the legal processes which can mount pressure. So that is the one difference in the 2021 rules, where the metaphysical nature of internet intermediary companies, which were simply in the electronic world or the digital world, have been moved into the physical domain by necessitating the fact that these internet intermediaries now must have a brick and mortar presence, so to speak, in the country. Till date, they were not required. For example, if I have to start an internet intermediation company, I could have started it from Singapore. It would have become world famous. I need not have had a physical presence in this country in terms of an officer. I could therefore have a greater latitude, so to speak, in terms of the dialogue on free speech. Now, how does this relate to the topic of the day? The essence is this. Internet intermediaries are not free speech proponents. Let's not give them that great umbrella and say that, oh, you are saviors of the world. The internet intermediaries have a business model to make sure that they provide the residents of a jurisdiction a platform for free speech. That's all it is. They provide the tools for you and me to exercise our constitutional or fundamental right of free speech here. Or in the Middle East, it gives the tools for that some person who does not have a constitutional right for free speech, but nonetheless exercises it protesting against the government. Because these internet intermediaries give you a tool where you can publish your views to the world at the flick of a button. God alone knows the Dandi March, where you have to have physical press without electricity, mechanically operated by humans in terms of kicking each pamphlet and then circulating the pamphlet in Saurashtra, or somebody doing so in Chennai and somebody doing so in Punjab. But today, on the flick of a button, I can tweet either against or for the present political dispensation, and the world knows it. Therefore, that platform of free speech which is given by internet intermediaries, albeit for profit, they are all profitable companies and they work for profit. It gives a scenario where It is not the internet intermediaries' right which is being suppressed when you actually control it harder. It is the citizen's right which is suppressed because the citizen is deprived of that tool of international publication, or he's deprived of that tool through which he exercises his freedom of speech and expression in a manner which was unknown possibly 10 years ago. The dimensions with which I can exercise my 19(1)A right today because of the existence of social media platforms is far greater than the dimensions with which I could have exercised the same right 30 years ago when I only had a black telephone and I had to make a lightning call to call somebody to communicate that information. Now just see the difference in terms of the granular quality of my 19(1)A right. The granular quality of my 19(1)A right is far stronger today because there exists internet intermediaries which provide me a platform of free speech. If that is the matrix and the constitutional mandates, my friend, can we look at a legislation or a subordinate set of rules which is attempting to continue to stifle it? Of course, the government of the day, I'm not talking for or against any government anywhere, but the government of the day would certainly want to make sure that they bring this in some form of regulation. Every government wants to make sure that it keeps its citizens under check so that the government can actually have some peace of mind. But in the constitutional matrix that we live in, it is not the job of the government to keep a citizen under check. It is the job of a citizen to keep the government under check. And therefore, my friends, internet intermediary platforms become a great tool at the hands of the citizen to call the government to check, to speak truths to power. And therefore, if you look at internet regulation from this perspective, not from the perspective of the government regulating internet, but from the perspective that any regulation of that freedom on the internet leads to the granular quality of your 19(1)A right being deprived, then the dimension of internet regulation and its impact on free speech could be understood. With this, I will stop. I wish I had more time. We had more dialogue sessions. I wish I was physically available with all of you to participate in because more impressions that come based on people, their mind, their orientation, not knowledge of the law apart, our personal orientations, preferences. That is what brings about some sort of a plurality to this whole dialogue. And that plurality of the debate is what brings the churn in terms of what the regulation should be. We miss that when it comes to interfacing through Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever it is. But I hope I have communicated at least what I have in my heart. It is not so much a legal thought process in my mind, but I genuinely believe as a free speech lawyer that internet intermediary regulation must be the least intrusive as is necessary to be legally compliant, not the most intrusive, as I think is the attempt which is going forward. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'll be more than happy to receive as many questions and answer them.
Thank you very much, sir. Before we proceed with any question and answer, we have Justice P.N. Prakash logged in.
Yeah, Mr. Puvaya, excellent. Really, very elucidative and very clear. Because I'm still in the other generation of which you said. So sir, thanks a lot. I've just asked one question. How do these banana republics they handle such thing? No, from what you say, I understand is that the government wants the physical presence of the representatives in India so that they could anytime catch them by their neck and make them comply. How do such things handled by banana republics,
yes,
Middle East and other places? Do you have any idea?
Yes, sir. Let me answer that let me answer that quickly. And being a proud Indian, sir, let's also possibly give the governments of the day the credit to saying that the governments may not really muzzle down these fellows physically, may not. But the fact that there is a potential to do that itself will chill free speech. Therefore, the issue is not whether the police will treat me well in the police station, but the potential that they can treat me badly in that police station by getting me to sit there itself will muzzle free speech down. And therefore, sir, for me to express myself, I must first have a green room which is available in my mind in solitude so that I can put my thoughts and express myself in as a warrior. That valor and warrior, sir, comes in only if I have the tools. If you ask Arjuna to fight a war without the weapons, I doubt he could have fought that war. Now, for me as a free speech warrior, it is that internet intermediary which is the tool. And it is the anonymity which is the tool. It is the lack of being in the physical jurisdiction which is the tool. Now, maybe our governments won't really muzzle them down, But I believe as a lawyer, there is a potential to muzzle them down. Therefore, there is a potential chilling effect on free speech. Sir, to the question on how do other banana republics or autocratic governance mechanisms deal with it, they simply block it. Sir, even under Section 69A of the Information Technology Act, forget 79, under 69A, there is powers even for our government to block certain content on the internet or direct the internet communication companies, for example, to direct the company which may be ACT, which may be Airtel, etc., which is giving you the broadband access, to simply block certain internet addresses, which means if you have a communication available in terms of an internet communication available to you, 4G communication in Tamil Nadu, the rule will be that so many IP addresses will be blocked, which means those websites will not be available to you. China has done that. China has blocked Google and Google therefore withdrew from China. Korea regularly blocks it. For example, sir, India also for right reasons have done it. You would have, sir, remembered about 2 years ago, there were about 550 or 560 pornographic websites that were blocked by virtue of a government order, which meant that all connection service providers, whether it is BSNL, Airtel, whoever it is, they will block those IP addresses to ensure that those websites are not available.
Okay.
That is what most of them do, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Puri.
Thank you.
Very kind.
We have Mr. KC Rashid, who had just raised his hand, sir. I'll just invite him.
Please, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, sir, for a wonderful lecture. And I think you have already answered my question. That is, my question was how the government is gonna control the intermediaries like Twitter and WhatsApp if they are not compliant the new rule as of now. Then you have answered that they may block the IP address and the website address. Do you think that that's the only way the government can control the intermediaries if they are not compliant with the rules?
Yes, the issue is this. For me to start an intermediation service, if I can use that word, or for me to simply establish an internet intermediary facility, which all of you can use, I require no registration. I need not be registered with any governmental authority or a regulator to start that business. I need not be physically present in this country. I'll take that example of Reddit. I don't know how many of you, at least in my generation, we are not Reddit users, but I'm sure at the younger generation, I can see the younger ones smiling. They use Reddit all the time. Reddit is actually the gateway to the internet today. What memes and jokes that you find on Google and Facebook today, Reddit would have had it 2 weeks ago. All these memes and jokes and good and bad content start on Reddit and come to other platforms. Now, Reddit has managed, we talk about so much, every day newspaper talks about Twitter, talks about YouTube, talks about Facebook, etc., etc. Have you ever heard any newspaper article on what is Reddit doing and why is Reddit not governed? It is completely below the radar. Reddit has some 40 crore users. Reddit has enough pornographic content. Reddit has absolutely egregious pro-government and anti-government content. It has good jokes, bad jokes, it has everything. Therefore, it is called the front page of the internet or the gateway today. But they have managed the art of being incognito, so to speak, because they do not have a presence in this country. They do not even have an indirect representation in this country. And Reddit says, do whatever you want. You want to block me, block me. When that bravado is brought to the table, government has not blocked Reddit. What can it do? It can, of course, block certain content on the internet. That power is available to them under the law. But most large internet intermediary companies will not even take it to that level. If they find that the regulatory framework in a jurisdiction is not germane to their business model, as I said, they are not some great saviors of mankind. It is not germane to their business model. What is their business model? Providing a free speech platform is their business model. The minute they find that that is not germane, they possibly will withdraw themselves. That's what has happened, for example, in Korea. When I say Korea, I mean North Korea, not the South. The North Korean part of the peninsula. China, for example, Google does not operate, whereas a local search engine called Baidu operates. Now, India is wanting to do that. They're saying, okay, if Twitter goes, Ku will come. Ku is Indian. It's not about, there is no nationalism on the internet. Let's be very clear about it. I have my flag here. I'm as proud an Indian as you are. But I will still support the fact that we need internet intermediation services in this country so that I can speak truth to power, rather than saying, no, 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 all internet intermediaries companies must salute the national flag. Otherwise, they should be kicked out of the country. That's a dangerous precedent to set.
Thank you, sir. I'll just read out one question in the chat box by Mr. Suresh Madhav. If the central government's order of withdrawing Twitter as intermediary protection will be struck down, sir, what would be your views?
You see, the first rule as a lawyer I have learned is that you should never guess what a court will do. Never. Every time I have guessed that court will do something in my favor, I have lost. Every time I have come out and said, I have lost, this is gone, I have won. Therefore, if you ask me, first of all, will the government of India muzzle down Twitter and block it? My answer is no. No government, which is a democratically elected government, working within a constitutional matrix such as ours, let's face it, our constitutional democracy in terms of legal jurisprudence is an extremely mature democracy. We are not one of those Burundis of the world, with due respects to people from Burundi, or we are not people from the Alsace region of some mountains. Our governance matrix is fairly strong. Therefore, will the government of the day really lead to banning an internet intermediary in the country? Answer is no, they won't. But they will, of course, do what they can to ensure that the regulatory matrix is complied with everybody. Now, if there is an exercise of banning, and if that is challenged, will a constitutional court in this country hear everybody and consider it from a constitutional matrix and strike it down? Answer also, according as a constitutional law student, answer is yes. If you go back to Farooq or Chintaman Rao and those line of decisions, I'm now going back to the 50s and 60s. The law is very clear. You can bring in a regulatory matrix, but the restriction on the right must be least intrusive. That is only as intrusive as necessary to achieve the object. It can't be the most intrusive method also can achieve the object, but it can't be most intrusive. And that's what the US Supreme Courts have also said repeatedly. So therefore, if an internet intermediary company should be banned in India, then it must be so egregious that it will be banned in the US as well. I doubt that's what it is. Let's not compare our democracy to China or Korea, etc. We are miles ahead. I'm sure this posturing between the state and the intermediary will occur for some time. But that posturing will find, I think, an even ground at some point of time where there will be right balance, as, for example, in Shreya Singhal, what the Supreme Court did.
Mr. Venkatesh Kumar Armugam raises an issue saying, the rules which provides that the intermediaries should know the originator of the message, then would that not be an intrusion into privacy where there is end-to-end encryption?
You want a technology answer or a lawyer answer? Traditional wisdom, we have also been brainwashed in the way we have studied our law, right? I think at least the new generation, younger kids study hard and they get into the best universities. They are the best students in all other disciplines, but choose law over anything else. Most of us went to law school because we really didn't get anywhere else. And therefore we studied little or no law, I think, as students. And as we went along, I think effort came in, industry came in, and we did what we did. But if you ask me from a traditional perspective, the answer is that yes, from a scenario of governance, there will be an element of originator information which should come out, because you can't operate in secrecy. Let's be very clear. The pedestal of privacy as a fundamental right is not secrecy. The pedestal of privacy as a fundamental right is dignity. It is dignity of an individual which gives him a right under 21 to say that I must also have a right of privacy. It is not to say that I am entitled to keep certain information secret, and therefore that secrecy should morph itself as if it's a privacy right. The originator scenario from a technology answer is a secrecy scenario. Not knowing the originator because end-to-end encryption, not knowing the recipient because end-to-end encryption is a secrecy pedestal. I want to keep my communication between Sajan Poa and Om Prakash secret. I don't want anybody to know. Therefore, give me an encryption tool such that it is encrypted when it leaves my machine. It is encrypted when it reaches his machine. Only he has a decrypting tool which will decrypt that message. Only he can read it. If anybody else intercedes that message in between, they will only get a decrypted, encrypted scenario where it's all jumbled up. The Enigma code was a secrecy tool. In my view, as a technology lawyer, this case to saying that there must be end-to-end encryption, only end-to-end encryption will save the citizens of this country and give the right to privacy meaning is a wrong understanding. Encryption is a secrecy tool. Privacy is actually a dignity pedestal. For privacy to be a fundamental right which is actually felt by the people of this country, you don't need a scenario where it should be encrypted. You can know who the originator is. The originator can be in public domain, but the originator still can have a privacy right saying that information which I have given will not be used for a particular purpose, will not be used for profiling me, will not be used against me. That is the privacy tool. I'll give another example. I have a right to privacy regarding my views and a right to privacy that I will not be profiled, despite the fact that I am walking on a public road. The fact that I walk on a public road from my house to a gay bar because my sexual orientation is so, and I come back home every day, is on a public road. Therefore, that information is available in public domain. But I still have a right to privacy saying I will not be profiled as a gay person, as a queer person, or a heterosexual or a homosexual. That is the right to privacy. So my friends, please don't compare a technological tool of encryption to right to privacy. By doing so, we are actually looking at only one view of privacy. That is not the whole view of privacy. Privacy is a dignity tool. Privacy is not an encryption tool.
Mr. Prashant Rajagopal has this to ask. Sir, what do you have to say about emergency power granted to the Ministry of INB Ministry, blocking any content without hearing? Also, it seems news portals have to also comply with 2021 rules. Isn't it an infringement on free speech? What about legal news portals like LiveLaw? Where do they stand? Can they be prosecuted?
This very question LiveLaw raised before the Kerala High Court. LiveLaw is one of the few online curated content, whether they are a news portal or not, debatable, but at least they curate content on, and the part 3 of the rules apply also to online curated contents. And therefore they have got an interim order from a court indicating that there should be no precipitation qua them. So given that that is a live position in court, I will not really give the pros and cons of it. But please understand that today's study circle conversation was on part 2 of the 2021 rules. It is on how an intermediary should be or should not be governed. We are not talking of news portals or curated content providers. A news portal or a curated content provider need not be an intermediary. Even without being an intermediary, there will be, because a curated content will be actually editing the content. A news portal will be editing content. One of the grounds to become an intermediary under 79 is that you will not edit the content which is being transmitted. Therefore, part 3 has much more, vigorous questions that arise. Maybe we should keep that for another session and just look at part 3. But answer is, should emergency powers be given? Although I am a very strong, rabid free speech lawyer, I can tell you that emergency powers should be given for internet communications.
Thank you, sir. We've now come to the end of the Q&A session. I would now like to invite Mr. Ashok Pati, advocate in the Madras High Court, to render the vote of thanks for the day.
Good evening, everybody. I thank the organizers for giving me this wonderful opportunity to thank the speaker and all others here. At the outset, I specifically thank Mr. Sivashanmugam for pitching the name of Mr. Sajan Puvaya for this topic, and Mr. E. Om Prakash for taking it forward with Mr. Rana Mukherjee, Senior Advocate. I thank Mr. Rana Mukherjee for being a part of this organization and taking things forward. At the outset, I request the permission of the speaker to disagree with him in stating that he is a mediocre speaker. Today, our take was only to learn about the subject that was put forth before us. We had an extra bonus of him teaching us how to present the lecture. The version 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, the explanation to that set the right mind in the minds of the people here who are listeners to approach how the entire lecture is going to be done. It was a wonderful aspect that the speaker did not touch upon any of the rules in verbatim, but was able to explain in detail how the entire rules is going to affect everyone. We were also able to understand the hue and cry why this rule might affect the freedom of speech. I once again thank Mr. Sajan Puvaya for being here and presenting this wonderful lecture in spite of his busy schedule. I also thank him in advance for his next session, which will be in due course. I hope so. My thanks are due to the organizers and the people who have participants who have been present here in large number. The thought-provoking questions were really taking the Q&A session to the limelight. I thank one and all. Thank you.